Okay, Turkey Creek, part 2. So the Turkey Creek study is really what we are using as basis for this groundwater monitoring plan in terms of design, what we thought would be appropriate. But it was really set up under the impacts to look at impacts of the environmental muck dredging at Florida Tech. And so it was initiated in November 2016, and what we did was to establish 4 communities as close as possible to the Turkey Creek area, so we could see, are they different? Do they have different groundwater qualities? And so the communities that we set up are septic, one on septic, which is the red one up here. One that looked similar in density and soil type and distance to the creek, that's on sewer, and it's this purple one right here. And then we wanted to pick a reuse, a community that's on sewer and reclaimed, and the only community that's close to the creek in this area is basically this one, and these ones are a little further apart. So we picked this particular area. And in addition, we thought we really need to understand what's exactly what you said, reference, control area. So the Turkey Creek Sanctuary was also monitored for comparison.
The green.
Okay. Yes. So
the green.
The green,
okay.
Yes. This whole area. So the dots are where the wells are currently installed. For siting the wells, we did similar process. We modeled it. We tried to site the wells where we could. There was a lot of involved process in trying to get permission to put wells in people's backyards, so there's that too. And so we ended up installing 11 wells in June, and we have been monitoring those monthly ever since. So this is a little bit about how we install. We use geoprobes to install to minimize the impact, and plywood to try not to tear anybody's yards. So it's an involved process there. We looked at soil type to confirm what type of soil we're looking at. In the model, we are using basically USDA soils and making a lot of assumptions. So we actually take cores and we look at the percentage of organic in the soils. And so far, it's been pretty close, actually, in this particular area, which makes me happy that we use that as a benchmark at least. And so these are some of the preliminary results. In this case, we have 10 months of sampling. The April results weren't out yet to put in here. But the 4 lines are the 4 different types of treatments. So green, natural, yellow, the reuse, red, septic, and the sewers in purple. And this is total nitrogen. So if you look at the total nitrogen, the first thing that comes to mind is that all 3 types of communities do have a potential to have impact on your groundwater in terms of total nitrogen. There's a huge difference, a statistically significant distance, no matter how I've tested it, between the controlled and natural wells and all other types of communities. So this was interesting. So they're all, different than the reference. That was my first. Now, just because in some cases, the septic and sewer are kind of close together, that doesn't mean they actually look the same once you start looking at different types of nitrogen coming out of them. And so this is ammonia results. In sewer, we have had quite high numbers of ammonia coming out in this community. And the septic, those numbers vary through time as well. And you reuse, we pretty much don't have any ammonia at all coming out. So, and natural is pretty much low in all types of nitrogen. And the interesting point is the nitrite values that we have had are very different, particularly on the reclaim. So this is when we decided that it would be beneficial to include in this groundwater monitoring plan this type of setup where we look at reclaimed, sewer, and septic, as well as having some additional reference areas, so we better understand it. We would have thought that reuse and sewer, because reuse is on sewer, might have been similar. Right. But this was definitely different. And these are some of the fecal numbers that we have seen. And again, that's what you expect with fecal. You have sometimes some hits and sometimes you don't. But we have had actually one hit once in one well in the reclaimed that was quite high. And we have had septic, particularly in September, October, very wet, right? And we've had some sewer hits coming in. And I have to point out that those numbers came up, we installed an additional well in each of the communities right in November, and so that's when we started seeing, so this particular well that we are seeing more hits in the Seward area. So there is value in capturing, this type of setup and looking at fecal and other lines of evidence to see what is happening. And one of the other lines of evidence that we have added to this particular project has been looking at isotopes, which particularly 15N and 18O. And just to give you, this is just looking at 15N. What you're looking at here is, in blue, is the signature in comparison to what the air number of 15N. And what I really want to point out from here is that there are differences in the signature of 15N. The natural is a 4.7%, reuse was 7, and septic was 12.7. Now, those numbers do change depending on the concentration of nitrate. So we are using nitrate to get the 15N concentration. So if we have higher numbers, we usually get higher numbers also 15N. So there is a lot of complexity in using isotopes. You can't just look at the number and say, aha, this is what it is. So we need to look at several lines of evidence. And this is why we added also, we have fecal, and we added also 18O, which is another type of isotope. And so when we put it on the scale, so what this is showing you is how you can differentiate sources better when you have more than one type of isotope you're looking at. For example, you have 15N on the bottom x-axis, and on the y-axis you have 18O right here. And what you can see that if you were just going to use 15N, you pick the number, for example, 3, it could be soil, it could be mineralized fertilizer, or it could be rainfall. You don't know. It could be many things. So the fact that you have the 18O, you can start putting this on a plot and start understanding better what some of the numbers look like. So I want to point out we don't have the sewer neighborhood on here, which is a lot of people wanted to look. Let's look at sewer, because our nitrite numbers are so low for sewer. We didn't have anything high enough to be able to do isotopes so far in our first batch. Now that might have changed now, so this is just preliminary based on half of the samples, so we are sending more samples to the lab and getting more isotopic results. But what you can see here is how these samples, even within the same neighborhood, the septic, how they have quite a lot of range. And actually that range is, if you were to map when they were taken, it's through time. So as time goes on, typically the signature of 15N keeps increasing and 18O keeps increasing. That's why you see this arrow going up. You expect that through time the signatures change. So there's a lot of complexity in looking at isotopes. You have to use a lot of lines of evidence and actually get a lot of data through time to start looking at what are we looking at here. Okay, part 3 of the presentation, the monitoring plan. What are we doing now?
Could I ask a question or two?
Yes.
This seems to be telling us something about reuse water. Yeah. And there ain't much in the plan that deals with it. And in general, the zeitgeist is that it's a cosmic good. I wonder if maybe we shouldn't be looking at that for future allocation of, both on a policy basis and possibly also a trust fund spending basis, to challenge the question whether reuse water is in fact solely a good with no downside.
I think we have.
I
think the plan does.
The original plan included 2 upgrades to 2 plants to reduce the concentrations in the reclaimed water at the Titusville Osprey plant and the Palm Bay Wharf. Both of those projects are under contract. In the 2018 update, Melbourne came in with a request to upgrade their plant, and so that was approved by the board, recommended by you and approved by the board. The one that looks, the next most interesting one, those were the 3 highest concentration. The next one is West Melbourne, and I've already met with their consultants, and they're looking at the possibility and whether they have space, and looking at trying to get some cost estimates together so we can determine whether that looks cost effective.
Do we know what those new numbers are going to be? I mean, how much of an improvement compared to the reuse from one of these upgrades?
Yes.
We know, so how much, or how better as far as removing the
Well,
nitrogen?
we know what it'll be coming out of the plant, going into the reuse lines.
Right.
What we don't know is how that will translate into groundwater. So one of the important things in collecting this information now in the areas where we are going to
To have the
upgrade the
pre and
reclaimed
post.
is we need that, a full year of pre-project data.
Okay.
So we, because when we started the planning process, we knew that reuse was an issue. And I want to just make sure everybody understands that all of the plants currently in the county are working within their permit. So they're allowed to do what they're doing right now. But we decided to focus on that because we knew it was an issue. And this basically
It's
is
confirming that.
confirming that. And this is the amount of money we're putting into it isn't small. I mean, it's, each plant, I think, is about $8 to $12 million, if I'm not mistaken.
Titusville is 8 million, Palm Bay is 1.4, and I
Okay.
believe Melbourne is about 6 million.
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent.
My memory is, all this goes back to the research that was done in Gainesville about uptake of nitrogen from plants in the middle of the roads, lawn, et cetera, not necessarily trees. So we hit this magic number of about 7. Anything above that goes into the lagoon. So we're not going to get down to that, but we're moving in that direction. Is my memory accurate?
Yes, so the Palm Bay upgrades will get them down to 7.5. The Titusville upgrades will get them down to 6. The Melbourne upgrades are aiming for about 6
Yeah. Which is significant.
milligrams per liter.
Oh, yeah, it's 30% to 40% reductions
Yes.
or more.
Or,
So-
yeah. The Titusville and Palm Bay concentrations, pre-improvements are 21 to 29 milligrams per liter. So getting them
Oh, I
down
thought
to
they
6
were
to
11
7
or
is
12. Wow.
it's a big.
So that monitoring, will that, as time moves on, when those improvements are done, will those wells give us information after the improvements? So that continued monitor, that's really neat. That's good.
Virginia, real quick. Give me a quick idea of what cocoa's reuse is. I noticed they weren't mentioned. I don't want to take up any time.
Yeah, it's.
You rattled off all those numbers off your head. I thought you would
Yeah, sorry. I know the hot ones. I don't know the less than hot ones. But it is in the plan, and the original plan only included the ones that were of a concentration that was high enough that based on those University of Florida studies, they were probably polluting the groundwater. In the 2018 update, because we kept getting questions, Cocoa Beach is missing. Yeah, Cocoa Beach is missing because they're already down at AWT. They're at 2.5 milligrams per liter. So we went ahead, we added all of them in the plan so everybody can see, what they so. All right, so your question was cocoa?
Cocoa Beach.
Cocoa.
Jerry Sellers, Cocoa, they are at 3.5 milligrams per liter.
So they're already there.
So okay to use their water.
Well, and just a quick comment. I concur with the investment in the plants, and it's above permit requirements. But don't forget, there's other low-hanging fruit related to reclaim. And if we have the data at some point as we're analyzing this, I'd love to see some of the usage patterns because it's pretty common that reclaim is either free or very cheap. And as a result, usage as compared to other sources of irrigation is many times 2, 3, or even 4 times the application rates. And so even as we reduce nitrogen, there's still potentially opportunity for significant additional low-cost reductions related to behavioral changes. Spraying it in the road that it runs straight into the lagoon, so whether you're at 3 or 10, it still has no value and it goes straight in. And the other is that when you, again, 3 or 10, yes, reducing it's great, but if it's over applied so much that the either runoff or infiltration rate is not getting used by the plants, then you've got higher contributions of those nutrients going straight to groundwater as opposed to productive use. So just don't forget there's another component of this.
Yeah, and so one of the 5 outreach components that you approved in the 2018 update is to look at those irrigation practices and do outreach to try to get people to understand the importance of what you just
And
said.
I just wanted to clarify, I only mentioned the fact that they were working within their permit, so people understand we're not paying for a maintenance activity, we're paying for an enhancement to the water treatment plants for the lagoon to reduce their nitrogen use. So they're working within their permit, because, and they don't have maintenance problems at the plant. What we're trying to do is basically enhance their work, basically, yeah.
And I want to cycle back 6 or 8 months. Courtney had talked about some sampling they had done, I think in Satellite Beach, and that well water was relatively high in nitrogen, thus you don't need to fertilize your yard if you're using well water. And when you looked into building test stuff, is there anything that you've discovered in the sanctuary area that would indicate that there's enough nitrogen in there naturally that if you're on well water, there's really no use for fertilizer in residential areas?
We haven't looked at that as not being part of the study. The fact is, in this particular reclaimed community, though, that people are using fertilizer abundantly, because we see all the time, services, professional services in the community every time we go sample everywhere. So they aren't aware that because they have this high reclaimed, high nitrogen water, that they don't need to use fertilizer. Actually, the HOA is paying for additional fertilizer to be put in there.
And they don't need that because clearly it's already there.
Sometimes it actually looks burnt.
Yeah.
But the concentrations that you're getting in the sanctuary are extremely low. They're like
Very low.
non-detect.
Right, they're very
And
low.
so they would not
Support, yeah. They're
Okay.
very low.
substitute for fertilizer.
Okay.
But that's probably different. I mean, this is in a natural area. It's probably different in any community that's developed, in a watershed that's developed.
That's what we saw.
So
yeah.
that's a little different than someone having a well in their yard.
And we hadn't figured a way to test it inexpensively, but it's still a good idea.
Right, we should.
Thanks.
Would there, and I know maybe this isn't for our current situation, but is there anyone that, or can we share this information with the people that give the permitting for the reuse line? It sure would have been great like 10 or 15 years ago if we would have known that the reclaimed water we're using is this high in nitrogen. So is there any way we can share this information with whoever gives that permitting out so they can share it with water body communities wherever they are?
I met with DEP last week, and we will continue to share this
Okay,
information.
good, because it would have been great to know 15 years ago that this
Yeah.
reclaimed water that is so great and cheap is not so great and cheap.
Yeah. Very true.
Good. Okay. Back to the part 3, last part, Groundwater Monitoring Study Plan. So this plan is what we just initiated a few months ago, and it really is a comprehensive investigation of environmental, geologic, and social drivers of wastewater. So this is a big project that looks at the entire Brevard County groundwater. And so part of this plan is to find a scientifically valid way to map priority areas that we should be looking at groundwater or to have higher groundwater potential, pollution potential to the lagoon. It also is to calibrate and refine current water quality models using data that we didn't have before throughout the lagoon. It includes quite a bit of sampling, both using permanent wells, which is similar to what we have done at Brevard and Turkey Creek, but also engaging citizen scientists to do these push points. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and the value of this. It also includes telephone surveys of septic tank behavior, so we know how much people actually know, if they have one, if they know if they are being maintaining it, etc. And finally, investigating a pollution mitigation strategy and seeing if this strategy might work in some areas, an inexpensive strategy to help reduce some of the septic loadings. So these are the tasks through it. Just giving you a little bit of, I'm not going to go in detail on all the tasks, but we have gone through the extensive effort of collecting data for the whole county. And what I mean collecting data, I mean actually looking at every single lateral to see which house is actually connected and which house is not to the sewer. and mapping, individual parcel basis. Is this a vacant house? Is this on septic? Is this on sewer? Is it on reclaimed or not for the entire county? Some data sources were very high and in quality, and some were less certain. So we also added that. So that's a valuable asset, first of all. Who is on reclaim, who is on septic, and who's on sewer, which is something we didn't have before. We have had surveys, but they had gaps. We also looked at all these variables we talked about, depth to water table, elevation itself, different types of soil variables. And we put this all together and looked at literature and decided what are some of the important parameters to prioritize and how are we going to do this. So this was done, and I'll talk a little bit about more that strategy that we use to prioritize communities. And the focus of this project was prioritize communities for sampling, to place, we only have so much money. We can't sample all the communities, so what is a representative number of communities that have higher loading potential? There's a septic tank knowledge and behavior task that's right now about to be done. It's completed, the calls are starting to come out. We have a quality assurance plan already approved and in place. And so our goal now is to install those wells. We are trying to get permission to install those wells, hopefully by the end of May, and start the sampling. So this is what we are collecting in terms of parameters. Field parameters are going to be the same as in the Brevard and in Turkey Creek. Those are typical, SOP, set of protocols by DP. Some of the differences here that we have decided to incorporate is to include phosphorus. So this came up, there's very little discussion on what is phosphorus doing in this groundwater, and when we have done a few samples from the Turkey Creek, which was not in the scope, FIT was kind enough to run those analyses, we have found phosphorus numbers surprisingly, ortho especially, surprisingly high. So we decided it was important to introduce the phosphorus and understand what is going on really in these communities also in phosphorus, not just look at nitrogen. And we decided the isotopes, continuing the isotopes and understanding how those can be used would be important. So a little bit of isotopes. This is N15, again, 15N, and I just want to mention that those, numbers vary a lot depending on what you're looking, the sources of what you're looking at. So you might have, for example, plants that have N15N of -10 to 10. For example, this is the big ranges. You do have effluent manure sometimes that is, in the 10 here to 20. Sometimes those numbers are lower, so it's a big range. If you are going to pick a number, you go up and down the chart, you can see you are hitting multiple types of sources. So just using one particular number is difficult to use. This is why we typically use those two numbers, and in this case, this is actually from a study that Dr. Soda and I have worked on for the Tampa Bay Estuary, where we're looking at totally different, we're looking at stormwater events and trying to track fertilizer, and using just N15, 15N, we couldn't tell if it was rainfall, nitrogen deposition coming from rainfall, or if it was fertilizer, but once we added 18O, we could clearly see that all those communities we were able to trace that this was mineralized fertilizer that we were looking at in the water. So you really need to use that along with concentrations and monitoring for time. And I didn't go for the complexity of it. I didn't put time in there. But if you trace it through time, we did monitoring for 12 months. You could see how the numbers keep creeping up, that's what naturally happens. The numbers keep going up. So taking one point in time and comparing that is shouldn't be draw too many conclusions based on one or two sampling events. Okay. I talked a little bit about, that we did a scientifically based approach to prioritize these communities, and this is a little bit of what we looked at. Our focus for this monitoring was, like I said, on single family. So we started with all the single family homes. We decided that we wanted to really look at areas that were clustered and dense enough, because for retrofit, likely you're going to not retrofit one or two houses until you have the big neighborhoods retrofitted. So we looked at houses within single family homes that are within subdivisions, and the ranking was done by subdivision and not by individual parcel. We use our extensive numbers to decide how to classify these communities. So if a community was 90%, for example, on septic, was called septic. Sometimes you have communities that have 10% vacant. And so that was went into our reasoning. If you have half the community developed and the other one not, maybe that's not as high priority, is not as dense. So we wanted to focus on dense communities, 90% on sewer or 90% on septic, and 80% or more on reclaim. Often we have communities that are on reclaim for the common areas, but not for the individual people's homes. So we wanted to capture those that actually had reclaimed all over. And then we determined what are some of the key pollution predictors, typically mentioned in the literature, and most of them are already in your plan. So you use a lot of those indicators. We ranked each of those individually based on different numbers and literature-informed decisions, and then finally we average those to have a prioritization score. So those are the priority parameters that we looked at. Density, we wanted as high dense as possible, but we wanted to stick with single-family homes. And the reason why we wanted to stick with single-family homes for this particular study is because that's really another variable that we can't really compare with Turkey Creek and with Breeze Swept. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be looking at multifamily, because it might be that multifamily, like you said, you have a lot more use and less septic tanks to retrofit. It might be best cost benefit there. So that might be something that you want to look at. Look at some of the multifamily. And I found quite a few, actually, multifamily areas that are on septic, which surprised me. The year built, so something older. So we had different periods, some of them depending on what kind of regulatory processes were available, and also depending on the age of some of the communities, you might have problems in the infrastructure. The distance, so we looked at distance to the inter-river lagoon and also the distance to any canal that might lead to the inter-river lagoon. So another point here to consider is that some of the open channels are really not mapped. That would be an important effort to do, because we might be missing some of these connections. And we looked at elevation using LiDAR data, digital elevation model. And the reason why we wanted to use elevation is that it is often a predictor of water table, depth to the water table. We looked at some percentage organic matter, hydrologic group value, hydraulic conductance, and porosity. Those are all soil-derived variables. So this tells you how important soils and knowing what your soils is. And finally, mean depth to water, which is also, right now, if we don't have data, obtained by soils. So I looked at those, and I looked at mean elevation. When those correspond, it makes you feel more comfortable. So I'm not going to go into the whole how we selected, and so we basically gave classes from 1 to 6, 6 being higher pollution potential for each of those variables, and 1 being the least, and then we score these together. So the selection here, what we did was we started with trying to find groups of communities that were on interest. So we didn't want to just have one septic community over here and then a sewer community 10 miles away. We wanted to try to find high-ranking areas that were close together, similar in type, so we could do another Turkey Creek type design. And so to achieve that, we ranked the septic communities first. We picked the higher ranking communities in septic, and we looked within a buffer distance of that to find what is the highest ranking sewer community within this higher ranking septic community. So this is just an example here of a subdivision that we selected in Pierre Century area, which is right here, the Heritage Isles, right on the water. So it scored, pretty high number. And so we put a buffer around it of half mile. We looked at all the sewer communities that were within a half a mile, and we had ranks for all of those when we picked which one is the closest, most similar, with the highest rank. This is how it was done. We also picked reclaim. With reclaim, though, there's a lot fewer communities, so we had to use a 1 mile buffer to get. So what is a reclaim? So in this case, this would be your septic, this is your sewer, and this is your reclaimed community. So this is that's one location where you're comparing 3 treatments together. Does that make sense?
I just wanted to jump in. So the funding for this, there's the $1 million coming from the legislature for the big groundwater study. We obviously wanted, so they could have just picked what worked best for for that study. But I wanted to dovetail that with the plan and the projects that we intended to implement with the funding in the plan. And so that red area, the north end of Indian River Isles, that's one of the septic to sewer priorities. That's that project is where the design scope has already been negotiated. So that's one of the first projects to be funded with the plan. And so we've signed a separate task order to fund groundwater monitoring for that project. And then the legislative funds are doing the yellow and the green. So both projects will work together to provide additional data sets to each other.
So we're using both projects. We are able to do a lot more communities and compare and actually have more valuable data. And I do have a table that shows which communities are funded by what. It's a little confusing, but that's how we leverage, funds, because you can sample 2 of these at the same time and run them to the lab at the same time rather than, drive to one and do another one. So we really try to use funds efficiently.
But do you have a date of when that project was built, the one in the red? Yeah.
I didn't bring it with me, but it's pretty old. I mean, it ranked pretty high because it was old. The soils had a lot of conductance, the hydraulic conductance. It's right on the lagoon.
Yeah.
It was probably 60s.
In the 60s? Okay.
Yeah, I think early 60s. So it did rank pretty high. But I can bring down those. I don't remember by heart. We looked at a lot of communities. A lot of data. And we also wanted to establish, in addition, controls. So we had one control in Turkey Creek that we're intending on keeping. And we wanted to look at controls in 2 other areas just to ensure that they weren't different. And so one of the controls we picked, this is an area in Titusville where we looked actually at just reclaimed sewer, and we didn't really have a good septic area for comparison. And we're picking the Enchanted Forest, escaped me. Enchanted Forest as a control, pretty big control area. In addition, we also have a control area set up on the Berry Island because we want to make sure they don't behave differently. So we'll have 3 controls that we can use to compare what we measure. So these are, in a nutshell, the areas that are being installed and were selected. So in red is the Titusville area. So we'll have 3 communities there. Well, 2 communities and a control, a reclaimed, a sewer, and a control. We have the Suntree area that I had just zoomed in a minute ago. We have the Merritt Island, which will be just a septic and sewer that are side by side, very similar. We didn't have any reclaim to use there. And then we have the Satellite Beach. We'll have a sewered area there. And then we have the South Beaches. We have reclaimed, a septic, and a control. So we can potentially use the one in Satellite Beach as the 4th treatment to compare with. So that's, in a nutshell, the community. So we kind of tried to spread them out as much as we could. They're all, pretty high ranking and using the same design. So this is kind of tells you which project was funded by what. I was looking at, I think, about 22 wells are being installed under the legislative project and 12 under the Save Our Lagoon. And we are keeping as well all the Turkey Creek wells in addition to that because we have so much data already on it. So those are another 11 wells. So quite a lot of wells from not having much data to we will have good data. Very briefly, citizen science. So what are we doing with the citizen scientists? Besides involving and engaging them in the lagoon, the idea is if we can figure out a way to augment our sampling without installing wells in an inexpensive way, this would be great. It also, we are augmenting the sampling at 2 of the communities, septic communities that are shallow enough, and we also are going to get enough data that helps us calibrate the model. Really, the more points we have, the better it is. So we're going to compare those data with the well data and see, can we use that? Is this something we could go and get someone to do 100 points in a day and get some valuable data? Okay, final slide. I know everyone's done. So septic to sewer retrofit projects can be monitored for efficiently in a scientifically valid way. The way to do this is really to set up control, to start monitoring before you start retrofitting. Sounds from our limited data that you might, depending on the soil conditions, start seeing results faster than I expected. I really expected soils to keep in the septic to sewer conversions. So it is probably soil dependent on fast it will flush out of the system. And the pilot study from Turkey Creek does show that different treatment types can have a potential. So we shouldn't just focus on septic, we shouldn't just focus on sewer or reclaim, we really should be looking at all of them. And there is a responsible way to address groundwater pollution, and that is to actually use scientifically valid methods to prioritize what is the highest pollution potential, and to actually, sample it long enough that you understand, with different lines of evidence, you understand what is coming out of that groundwater. I think that's it. Yes?
Ever since we started meeting here, we've heard various folks, Dr. DeFries and others, say that monitoring is important and monitoring is deficient. You're funded now, this year, in the trust fund, you're funded by the legislature. Mm-hmm. Do we have out-year funding programmed in our trust fund, and will we be able to compensate for a loss of legislative funding?
That's a good question. We'll see, how frequently, right now, this is set up for monthly sampling, so, we need to do it and see what it takes to continue doing it. But we do have $1 million a year set aside in the plan for monitoring the performance of, a subset of our projects, and certainly, this is a very important component of the plan.
Well, I think there's a legitimate question. What's the right dollar amount, and where do we get it, and how do we program it, and so on. I would trust you, too, to care about that.
I just wanted to make a comment that if there's been a lot of commentary lately because of the fear of the citizens about, the condition of the river, obviously. And so people who aren't real close to what we do every day have some misinformation. And part of that is that we don't need to do monitoring, and I see that a lot. And I just want, this presentation was incredibly timely because I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to splice out your presentation and send it through Facebook, because I think the residents need to really understand why this is important. It's financially, I guess stupid is the only word that comes to my mind right now, to move forward with such dollar amounts that we're using here on projects that may not work. It would be terrible to do that. So we have to monitor, and so $1 million a year is a small price to pay to do this. We have to do this. In fact, I think it's probably not enough, but we have to do this. And so I really appreciate your work, and thank you to Dr. Soto for everything the Marine Resources Council does, because we wouldn't be able to do our jobs well without having this information.
If I could just echo that, anytime you do a corrective action work, you have to do a validation sometime down the line, whether it's 6 months, 12 months, whatever makes sense. So not to do that, you really don't know if you're successful. Yeah. And that's how you fine-tune your operations or your sampling.
Right. Correct. And thank you to FIT, we wouldn't have, without their input, we wouldn't have the information we need to do the right thing. So it's good.
So 2 points. The word is irresponsible. If we spend $500 million of taxpayer money and don't know what the heck we're doing and don't know if we're getting results, that's wrong. I noted a number of folks grabbing their cameras and taking pictures of the screens, which is awesome. There's a lot of stuff up there. And since the beginning, all of these meetings have been recorded. This presentation is recorded. It'll be online. So all the stuff you took pictures of and the ones you missed, you will be able, and anyone in the public will be able to see this entire presentation or parts of it. And I want to thank you.
You're welcome.
Great stuff.
We're kind of the bang for buck board. That's one of the things we do. This is really fascinating. I wonder if we could get it down simple enough for a naval officer to understand and short enough to read so that we can communicate to the people that we're describing as not as well informed.
During the isotope part. I was really understanding what she was saying.
I was looking at you, I wasn't looking at you.
Well, and it's all
I still could
preliminary.
be a whole nother, discussion. I was just trying to put in that why we are doing it and why we're doing 2 types of isotopes. And
Could that be part of the $1 million we're handing out to come up with a citizens report that meets those 2 criteria? It's short and it's clear.
I think those first graphs did it very clearly to me, but it is preliminary information.
People may not read graphs. I'm going to tell you something, here's what I'm telling you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you, and that's a pretty good presentation if you do that.
I think it would be nice if they were translated into something like a simple meme that can be spread on social media. Simple meme. Simple.
Memes are us.
The monitoring that has been done is, just simple bullets would be great. I mean, a meme would be even better. But I agree, because social media, if you're reading it right now, I feel like I spend my entire weekend defending the plan's honor from people who, just the misinformation out there. I think there's a group of people that are purposely doing it, but regardless, we still have to give the truth to the community, and I think that would be helpful if we had that ammo.
We have a clear measure that we are not communicating effectively the basic information that needs to get out there.
Yep.
And that's something we need to work on. We got the bucks there, and it's not for scientists and technicians to figure out how to get it out there. It's for communicators, public relations types, people in marketing, et cetera. And that's a skill set that may not be represented here, but it's viable.
I do know of a certain individual that has that skill set, but
It's important for us to remember that we need the science behind us, and all of this is great and for scientists, but this isn't what, in many cases, won't be what resonates for the public. So we do have to tell a story, and whether it's an infographic or a meme or whatever it is, don't get caught up in that we've got to push hard and sell the science. We can't be contrary to the science, but we have to align with what the passions and the priorities of the citizens are, and it may not be about isotopes. It's not about isotopes. So, making that, recognizing that both discussions have to occur, and they're likely to not be one and the same, is really important.
Every piece of this science that matters to us and we care about needs an elevator speech. And I think that's part of the deliverables in all future studies. Give us 600 words, give us an elevator speech, give us 5 bullets that matter.
Danielle? I think expecting someone to watch a 20-minute video is... I would like people to watch the 20-minute video of the presentation, but they're not going to. They're going to get on social media and respond to what people are saying and spend an hour responding to something instead of watching the video sometimes. And I think that conveying things in a very simple manner that people can either, 1, watch a really quick video, or 2, click on an infographic and have something readily accessible, or that the slideshows are made for public to understand easily. Charles?
Yeah, I was going to say that there's a couple of fundamentals to education. One is make it easy for your reader, so know your audience. And the second thing is that to understand your audience, and if they have misinformation, like we've been talking about, that you have to get that. You have to understand what that misinformation is and replace it with the correct information.
absolutely, yes.
So I have no idea what an isotope is. I mean, I fish, okay? But I made a note, fecal. I know what fecal is, and when we went from septic to sewer, it went to 0 in the groundwater. That's all I need to know. I mean, I appreciate everything you've done, and I'll ask Charles or John or one of these scientist guys to explain how the ammonia and nitrate, because I still don't understand that, but I understand when all those things drop, it worked. So there's my meme.
I know people.
My
No more
standpoint
poo-poo
is,
in the
the other
groundwater.
is, education's great, and we've got to have it out there, but the other piece of any change management approach is to identify who the influencers and the trusted people out in the community are that need to be at buy-in, be on our side. I just went through a completely separate issue where the science was behind us and we were right, and the media and other issues got out ahead, and once the tone got set, it wasn't going to be changed. And we've got to identify who the influencers are and those people that might be skeptical, because let's face it, we look and feel like a government organization, because we're appointed by a government organization. There's not a lot of trust for that, so we've got to help build some trust of influencers, of people that might otherwise be skeptical, but that can stand behind what we're doing and help carry that elevator speech forward. So I think that's another component of what we have to consider.
I don't know if you guys saw, I sent around the emails and comments from the Facebook article, and I had some ideas that I was going to bring up today about that. I can mention them briefly now, or we can talk about this later, because I think we've kind of moved away from this into a little education. But just briefly, two of the things I was going to say is I was going to recommend that I think, in my opinion, it would be nice if somebody from this panel, after every meeting, wrote a little bit about what the meeting meant to them, or what they went through, or what they learned. And I think that serves two purposes. Not only does it allow people to see who you are, so you don't seem like a government person, because we're really not. I mean, we ask questions about sunshine law all the time. I mean, really, we're not. And actually, on the agenda today, there's sunshine law. Here we are. So I know it may seem like it, but I think it would be great if somebody was able, a different person was able to write in their words, what the meeting was. And then also, like the influencers, I think that I know I would be more than welcome to, and maybe if there's a list that we had of people that would be more than welcome to go onto radio shows in the area, or interviews, and actually go and sit down and just talk to the people, and let them know who you are, and then you get to know who they are. And I think that it's that meeting, when you stop becoming a name and you start becoming a person, is when you can get the information that's needed out to people. But I do have some more ideas too, but it's just, we can go over those later.